December 25th, 1944. 4 hours past midnight. In a scatter of stone farmhouses called champs, on a frozen ridge northwest of Bastogne, a handful of American paratroopers lie in foxholes hacked into ground as hard as concrete. The moon is low and waning. Snow lies thick across the fields, and every man knows that white ground means black shapes will show against it the moment anything moves. Somewhere behind them, in a 16th-century château called Rolle, the headquarters staff of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment has just finished a quiet Christmas Eve Mass in a stone chapel, the calm occasionally broken by the crump of a distant shell. It is meant to be the quiet side of the perimeter. Nobody expects the Germans to come here. They are wrong. At around 02:45, mortar and gun rounds begin falling on the village. 15 minutes later, German aircraft drone low overhead and drop bombs indiscriminately near the château. Then, out of the tree line to the northwest, shapes begin to move. Roughly 50 grenadiers of the German 77th Grenadier Regiment, dressed in white snowsuits that make them almost invisible against the drifts, crawl forward under the last light of the setting moon. At 0400, they rush the edge of the village. Within the hour, a full battalion has joined the assault. And behind it, grinding up the frozen lane from the north, come the tanks. Champs is not a famous name. It has no cathedral, no monument older than the war that put it on the map. And for most of the 20th century, it would have meant nothing beyond the parish boundary. But on this particular morning, this cluster of farm buildings and a village school sits directly between 18 German Mark IV tanks, an entire Volksgrenadier regiment, and the road into Bastogne. If that road opens, the last major American position blocking the German drive towards the river Meuse falls with it. Adolf Hitler has personally demanded that Bastogne be taken by the end of Christmas Day. Standing in his way, along a stretch of frozen farmland roughly the length of a modern airport runway, are men of a single American Parachute Infantry Company, some tank destroyers borrowed from a unit still refitting after Normandy, and whatever artillery can be scraped together in time. What happens in the next few hours will decide whether Hitler's last great gamble in the West lives or dies. This is the story of how it died, at a village most people have still never heard of. To understand why champs mattered so much, it is necessary to go back 9 days, to the morning of December 16th, 1944, when Germany launched the offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Under cover of thick winter fog that grounded Allied aircraft, roughly 200,000 German soldiers surged out of the Ardennes forest, along a front the Allies had considered too quiet, too wooded, and too unimportant to hold in strength. The plan was audacious even by Hitler's standards: smash through a thinly held American line, seize the road network of eastern Belgium, and drive all the way to the port of Antwerp before the Allies could regroup and bring their air power to bear. Because every significant road in the region converged on one small market town, the whole German timetable depended on capturing it quickly. That town was Bastogne. The American 101st Airborne Division, resting and refitting in France after the brutal fighting in Holland, was rushed into the gap. Traveling more than 170 kilometers through rain and sleet in the backs of open trucks, the division reached Bastogne on December 19th, some units arriving with barely hours to spare before the Germans closed the ring. By December 20th, the town was completely encircled. Inside the perimeter sat roughly 11,000 American soldiers, desperately short of ammunition, food, and winter clothing, holding a ragged, thinly manned defensive line against a besieging force that, at its peak, numbered several German divisions. The shortages were not exaggeration for effect. Many rifle companies of the 101st had never been brought back to full strength after their losses in Holland. And the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, which would carry the weight of the fighting at Champs, went into the siege at roughly 85% of its establishment. Winter overcoats and proper boots were in desperately short supply. Men wrapped their feet in whatever cloth they could find and packed newspaper beneath their tunics against the cold. Artillery ammunition ran so low that gunners were, for a period, restricted to a handful of rounds per gun per day. When German commanders sent a written surrender ultimatum into the town on December 22nd, warning of annihilation and offering an honorable capitulation, the American response was a single word so blunt that the German officers who received it needed it explained to them in plain English: nuts.
The weather compounded every problem. Thick, low cloud had grounded Allied aircraft for the first week of the offensive, denying the encircled garrison both resupply and the fighter bombers that might otherwise have shredded any German column caught moving in the open. Temperatures fell well below freezing most nights, and the ground froze hard enough that digging a proper foxhole could take hours rather than minutes, leaving many defensive positions shallower and more exposed than the men holding them would have liked. Frostbite and trench foot began claiming casualties almost as quickly as German shells did, a slow attrition that never appeared in any official tally of the wounded, but ground down the garrison's strength all the same. By Christmas Eve, an airdrop of supplies 2 days earlier had eased the worst of the shortages, but the perimeter itself remained a thin, brittle thing, a ring of foxholes stretched around the town with no reserve worth the name. The Germans facing the western side of that ring, around Champs and the neighboring hamlet of Rolle, understood this better than the Americans realized. General Heinz Kokott, commanding the German force encircling Bastogne, had a fresh card to play. The newly arrived 115th Panzergrenadier Regiment of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division, reinforcing his own battered 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Combined, they gave him something close to 3 attackers for every defender along the stretch of line running through Champs. Kokott's plan was simple and, on paper, close to unstoppable. Punch through the thin American positions at Champs and Hemrulo before dawn, while the weather still grounded Allied fighter bombers, then drive his tanks straight down the open road into the center of Bastogne. If it worked, the siege would end in German victory on Christmas morning itself, precisely as Hitler had demanded. What made the position at Champs so dangerous was not a lack of American courage, but a lack of everything else. The 101st Airborne had jumped and glided into this campaign as a light infantry force, never intended to fight a static defense against massed armor for over a week in open, snow-covered farmland. It had no organic tanks of its own. Its principal anti-tank weapons were towed guns, a battalion of attached tank destroyers still recovering from earlier fighting, and the individual soldier's own bazooka, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher roughly the length of a broom handle that fired a small, shaped charge warhead capable of piercing several centimeters of armor plate if it struck at close range and the right angle. Against a company of infantry dug into open fields, 18 Mark IV tanks and a battalion of grenadiers should, by any reasonable calculation, have been an overwhelming and rapid victory. The American answer to this imbalance was not a single wonder weapon, but a system, built out of hard lessons and whatever equipment could be scraped together. General Anthony McAuliffe, the artillery officer left in temporary command of the division, had arranged his forces not along a conventional front line, but in a complete, all-round perimeter, sometimes nicknamed by the men themselves as a kind of besieged goldfish bowl. Because the defenders were surrounded on every side, McAuliffe positioned his artillery battalion centrally, within the ring, so that their guns could be swung to mass fire on any threatened sector within minutes, rather than being tied to a single fixed front. It was, in effect, turning the disadvantage of encirclement into a strange kind of advantage. Wherever the blow fell, the guns were never far away. At Champs itself, the defense rested on Able Company of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, dug in along the northwestern edge of the village, its right flank tucked into a stretch of woodland linking up with the regiment's 2nd Battalion. Supporting them, positioned along the roads leading into the village, were tank destroyers of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, lightly armored vehicles mounting a gun considerably heavier than anything carried by ordinary infantry, built for exactly the job now required of them, killing tanks from a static, camouflaged position before the tanks could kill you first. Behind the whole position sat the guns of the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, ready to drop a curtain of high explosive onto the approaches to the village the instant the call came in. It was not an impregnable line. It was a thin, improvised, bitterly cold one. But it had just enough teeth, positioned in just the right places, to make the coming battle a great deal more even than the numbers suggested. Manufacturing and production numbers for the equipment involved illustrate just how improvised this defense really was. The bazooka carried by the paratroopers had been rushed into mass production early in the war and manufactured by the tens of thousands across American plants, a cheap, simple weapon designed so that an infantryman with only a few hours of training could use it. The tank destroyers of the 705th Battalion, built on a modified tank chassis and mounting a gun roughly comparable in caliber to a small artillery piece, had been designed specifically as a stopgap answer to exactly the kind of massed armored thrust now bearing down on Champs, though nobody who built them could have imagined they would end up defending a Belgian farming village on Christmas morning. None of it was new or exotic equipment. Its value lay entirely in how it was used, dug in, camouflaged, and ready to fire the moment the German column came into range. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The German infantry broke into Champs itself within minutes of their first rush at 0400, and for a time the fighting became a confused, close-range scramble through farmyards and stone outbuildings in the near darkness, rifle and grenade at a range of meters rather than hundreds of meters. Company B of the 502nd moved up in support of the defenders already engaged, and gradually the American paratroopers pinned the infiltrating grenadiers down among the buildings they had seized. Then the German armor arrived. 18 Mark IV tanks, formed in line abreast, rolled towards the village and the two American companies moving up the road to reinforce it. 2 tank destroyers took the initial shock of the attack head-on and were knocked out in the exchange, buying just enough time for the following company to pull back in order to a patch of woodland between Champs and Hemrulo, rather than be caught in the open. From there, paratroopers poured rifle and machine gun fire into the tanks escorting infantry, clearing German soldiers from the vehicle's decks even as the armor itself pressed forward. When the German column wheeled back towards Champs, 2 more tank destroyers caught it mid-turn and destroyed 3 of the panzers outright. The paratroopers, using bazookas and whatever else came to hand, accounted for at least 2 more. By mid-morning, the attack had broken apart into isolated, dwindling pockets of German infantry still fighting inside the village, increasingly cut off from support as their armor was destroyed or withdrew. Records from the fighting remain incomplete, as they so often do in an action fought in darkness and fog by small units with little time to file reports. But American accounts described the Germans who had broken into Champs being rounded up or destroyed piecemeal through the morning. Perhaps the most haunting trace of the battle is not a casualty figure at all. In the village school at Champs, after the fighting had died away, American soldiers found a message chalked on the blackboard by a German officer who had sheltered there during the night. May the world never live such a Christmas night again. No comparable attack anywhere else along the Bastogne perimeter that Christmas came so close to breaking through. Elsewhere around the ring, German assaults over the preceding week at Noville, Marvy, and along the eastern approaches had each been fought off in turn, but usually by forces attacking in smaller numbers or without the concentrated armor Cocotte committed at Chain. The German army had, in fact, tried a broadly similar approach earlier at Bastogne and elsewhere in the Ardennes. Masses of infantry supported by tanks, aimed at a single weak point, timed to exploit fog and darkness. It rarely worked as intended, because German fuel supplies, spread thin across the whole offensive, and Allied air power, the moment the weather cleared, punished any column that failed to break through in its first rush. At Champs, Cocotte had assembled everything he needed for exactly one clean attempt, and when the American perimeter held through the first 90 minutes, his plan had effectively failed, because there was no reserve behind it to try again before daylight brought the fighter bombers back into the sky. The American defense, by contrast, drew its strength from flexibility rather than mass. where German commanders, hemmed in by rigid timetables and Hitler's direct interference in operational decisions, often found themselves unable to adapt once an attack began to falter. McAuliffe's centralized all-round artillery arrangement meant reinforcement and supporting fire could be redirected within minutes of the alarm being raised. It is a striking and telling contrast. 18 German tanks and a full infantry regiment thrown against a single reinforced company, defeated not by matching strength for strength, but by superior coordination between infantry, tank destroyers, and artillery, each covering the other's weaknesses. American losses at Champs were real and are not fully recorded to this day, but they were a fraction of the price paid by the attacking Germans, who left burning tanks and dead grenadiers scattered across the approaches to a village most of them had never heard of before that morning. The wider significance of what happened at Champs became clear within hours. It was, in effect, the last serious German attempt to break into Bastogne from any direction before relief arrived. The following afternoon, December 26th, tanks of General George Patton's Third Army broke through German lines to the south and reached the town, ending the siege that had begun 8 days earlier. Had the western perimeter at Champs given way that Christmas morning, Patton's relieving column would have been racing towards a town already in German hands, a considerably harder, bloodier, and less certain proposition. Instead, the defenders held, the ring stayed closed until help arrived, and Bastogne passed into American military memory as one of the defining stands of the entire war. The material impact of the fighting was significant. Several German tanks and a substantial body of infantry were lost for no ground gained. But the psychological impact may have mattered more on both sides. For the exhausted, under-equipped Americans holding the perimeter, throwing back an assault by a fresh armored regiment on Christmas morning with nothing but towed guns, borrowed tank destroyers, and personal courage became proof that the siege could be endured to its end. For the Germans, the failure at Champs was one more sign, alongside failures elsewhere along the front that same week, that the great gamble of the Ardennes offensive was slipping away, its tight timetable unraveling village by village. Champs did not, by itself, decide the Battle of the Bulge, but it closed one of the last doors through which the Germans might have reached Bastogne before Patton did. And in a battle where timing decided everything, that closed door mattered enormously. Today, the events of that Christmas morning are marked by two modest memorials, one in Champs itself and another dedicated to the men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment in nearby Longchamps. The château at Rolle, where the regiment's headquarters staff heard Mass on Christmas Eve before the shelling began, still stands. The blackboard message is gone, along with the schoolroom that held it, but the words themselves have outlived the building, quoted in histories of the siege as one of the few genuine glimpses of how the fighting felt to the men on the other side of the line. Return, for a moment, to that frozen field before dawn. The moon is setting. 50 men in white move forward across the snow, certain that the quiet western edge of the American line will give way before the sun comes up. They are wrong, and the manner of their being wrong is worth remembering precisely because it involved no secret weapon, no miracle of engineering, nothing that would ever appear in a museum case labeled with a serial number. It involved a single understrength parachute company, a handful of borrowed tank destroyers, some artillerymen willing to redirect their guns at a moment's notice, and men who had not eaten properly, slept properly, or been warm in more than a week, holding a village nobody outside their own regiment could have found on a map. Hitler wanted Bastogne by the end of Christmas Day. He wanted it badly enough to commit a fresh division, 18 tanks, and the element of surprise, to a single narrow stretch of Belgian farmland he believed was undefended. He was given, instead, a burning tank column, a chalked message of despair on a schoolroom blackboard, and a road that never opened. The men who stopped him at Champs were paratroopers by training, farmers' fields their battlefield, and Christmas morning their deadline too, though for entirely different reasons. They held. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. A handful of tired, half-frozen soldiers in a village most of the world has forgotten stopped Hitler's last panzers cold, and by doing so, helped close the door on the last great German offensive of the war in the West.